Welcome to Who Shaves the Barber, a weekly podcast where we explore paradoxes, thought experiments, and other pointless problems. I'm William Nava. Okay, so today I've got with me Brian Nuckols. Brian is, first and foremost, a friend of mine. Is also a brilliant thinker, someone that I've had really fantastic conversations about various topics in philosophy. I really hope that I can actually have you a couple times because there's a few things that we've talked about that I think are really interesting and have really interesting philosophical implications. Some of the stuff that, well, let me not go into the other stuff. One of the most interesting things we've talked about is dream analysis, the ontology of dreams, basically the whole philosophical realm of dreams. And this is pretty different from the other stuff that I've talked about on this podcast before, but it's stuff that I find really interesting. So first, let me ask you why you're so particularly interested in dreams. What got you into it?
Yeah, well, thanks first for the generous introduction. I appreciate that, and I'm really excited to be here. But yeah, to answer your question, my interest in dreams is very experiential. So I had a really intense dream, and it was incredibly, it had implications that bled into my real life. And after that, it was just, I kind of had this obsession with what was the nature of that. Was that some kind of placebo? And I just kind of really interrogated the reality of that kind of what I would call now an encounter with my dream life. And so, I mean, I guess I'll just go into details of what happened with that one, if that's okay. I think that's a good way to kind of introduce this conversation.
Yeah, please. One of the things that I appreciate about the times that we've talked about this in the past is that, I get the sense that your interest in this is very much personal and involved with your own kind of practice with it. And so please, by all means, give me the personal version of it.
Okay. So I came to the conclusion that, I became aware that I had like what I would call like a form of depression, like I wasn't engaging with any kind of emotions. And this was kind of jarring to just kind of realize this. I can't explain how I made this conclusion, but so actually I do. Someone told me, it's like, are you feeling emotions right now? And it just kind of jarred me. And I was like, I don't think so. Like the big ones, like anger, like lust, joy, rarely, but there was no kind of middle ground. There's no kind of emotional interaction with the world. And that was jarring. And as soon as I became aware of that, I just got really sad out of nowhere. I was just sad. I had no energy. And I was like, where I was living at the time didn't, I had really nowhere to turn but like the internet, Wikipedia. And started looking into it, into the forms of let's say the modalities of therapy that I was looking into, they weren't working. I wasn't having any success with them. And so kind of out of desperation, I started looking into less conventional ones.
Just a quick question. Without going too deeply into them, what were some of those modalities that you kind of dabbled into and decided, this isn't working for me?
Well, first and foremost, it was just kind of the pharmacology. And I can't say I experimented with any of those drugs, but just looking at kind of the meta-analysis, like you're looking at like a 22 to 28% success rate, self-report success rate, and with some pretty heavy side effects, like some undesirable side effects. And then kind of mainstream cognitive behavioral therapy, which I'm not going to diss because I think I was practicing this with myself. I didn't have a therapist. So yeah, definitely. And I've later latched onto some of those techniques that are really useful, but they just weren't working at the time. And yeah, so those two in particular, because at the time I was really into the kind of those are kind of best practice in the academy, let's say. And that's where I started. And so from there, I jumped into, I found I've always been kind of a lucid dreamer. That's happened naturally for me. I've just become conscious in my dreams. And I somehow came across the work of Carl Jung, who works heavily with dream analysis. And it was just, that was like, oh, okay, I can lucid dream. Most people can't. I didn't even know that most people didn't. And he talks a lot about dreaming. So let me start kind of investigating these techniques. And so I kind of went through that process, which we'll probably jump into in more detail. But going through that process, I had a dream where so one of the things you have to do with lucid dreaming is you have a glass of water and you drink it, and then you kind of pause for a second and decide if you're awake or asleep. And so one thing I did was I kind of ritualized that, and I put a glass in my restroom and would drink any time I walked in there. And so in my dream, I was dreaming of that process. I took a drink, and like the water didn't go down, and I was like, sweet, like this is a lucid dream, like let's go. And that kind of excitement woke me up, quote unquote, and back into my bed. And this pattern repeated. And I soon was not lucid dreaming anymore and was caught in a recurring nested dream that, it appeared to me that it was infinite, like it didn't stop. And it was a terrible, terrible, terrible nightmare. Terrible. And it was, definitely the most frightening experience I've ever had. And all of a sudden, just randomly, and I've actually compared this to, I wrote an extended essay about this, comparing this process to Groundhog Day, which is a bit on the nose, but you can read that if you're really interested in it, anyone watching. But I became aware that I needed to look into the mirror, like that just popped into my dream head, and I couldn't. Every time I would try, I would wake up. Then I finally did it, and there's just a child's face that was like rotting and like decaying. And I was like, wow, that's really disgusting and gross. But that woke me up, or I became lucid again. And I was like, oh, okay, well, that's strange. And then I just got this impulse to walk downstairs where I was, and I walked into an authority figure from my past, who I'm not in contact with anymore, who when I was very, very young, I think about 2, and I've confirmed the reality of this, that this had something like this had happened at this age. This person was kind of berating me and yelling at me in reality, and then I kind of dreamed, I had some kind of experience reliving this in the dream. I just picked the child up, who I guess was me, and hugged it and ran away, and then I woke up into this world. And wherever we were at, and just felt, it was only 40 minutes had passed, and I just felt I was extremely just elated and just really enthusiastic. And a few of the symptoms that I was dealing with that kind of thrust me into this depressive episode literally dissolved within 3 days. And it was just floored me that something like that could happen. And yeah, since then it's kind of been off to the races. I've really researched the subject deeply and tried to apply this kind of, I guess, a kind of Jungian analysis with maybe an updated philosophy of mind elsewhere in like self-improvement and working in a few different other fields. So yeah.
That's really fascinating. So let me take a step back, because I want to get back into the specifics of dream analysis and dream techniques and using it in practice. But I kind of want to take a step back and sort of address the question. First, let me address the question: why do you think that this is relevant to philosophy? Right. So what is interesting to you about dream analysis or just dreams in general from a philosophical perspective?
Okay, so that's a great question. And I think I'm going to use a really gratuitous Game of Thrones metaphor. So you've got the wall there. Like, I don't know how familiar you are all with Game of Thrones, but you've got this wall. And if the barbarians get over the wall, like the realm is done. So if you lose there, you lose everywhere. And I think the conception I have of the world, which is there's more there's more, the mind is more than the brain. Dreams, I think, is the wall for that argument. And so let me just unpack that a little. So for a long time, what I would call the more deflationary theories of dreams rejected lucid dreaming completely. They said that is not possible. That doesn't happen. That's some kind of false memory, and that's based on Wittgenstein, actually, because you couldn't empirically prove it. So
sorry. The theory was not that lucid dreaming didn't have any special kind of significance, or that it wasn't really like it was that it actually can't happen.
Yeah, it was impossible, and that was thought up until I don't want to misquote this. I know it was proven in Stanford, and I can't remember the guy's name. He's a very smart guy, and I want to engage with his material more. The way he proved it was, but yes, to answer your question, it was completely rejected. In the kind of Western academy in neuroscience, the cognitive neuroscience. That's something I'm interested in. Cognitive neuroscience kind of rejected it, and philosophy of mind rejected it. And this guy at Stanford, what he did is this really interesting thing where they rehearsed eye movements, and you can become lucid. They tied it to certain cycles within REM, so they timed it. And then if the empirical question was, if they do these really odd, bizarre like eye sequences between like 30 and 90 minutes after they go to sleep, then like it's a very like you're not just going to do that randomly. Like they must be lucid and moving their eyes like that, because while you're lucid, your eyes do move how you move them in the dream. So they showed that in the test, and you know, that it's kind of been done again and again, and it's not even controversial. Now, why I use this Game of Thrones metaphor is one of my personal aspirations in life is we can do that again, but choreographed between two people. Now, if that happens, that implies some kind of shared space outside of the brain, where two consciousnesses are interacting in some way. And there's anecdotal evidence of this that we can maybe run through, that this can happen, but that would be a pretty devastating counterstrike, a counter-reformation to the some of the other what I'll say kind of abusively deflationary theories. Does that make sense?
I think so. Let me just try to make sure that I understand. So first of all, I think it seems to me ridiculous that there was ever a theory that lucid dreaming wasn't happening, just because there's so much, there's just so many reports of it that It just seems kind of silly to to doubt it. I suppose I could see it being plausible to say something like, well, you may think you're conscious when you're lucid dreaming, but you're not really. Mm-hmm. But even that, it's like, what is there to consciousness other than being aware of the fact that you're conscious? So, whether that's happening in dreams or in whatever state, that's really all that there seems to be to it. For there to be, that's all that seems to be really necessary for us to be able to say that we're conscious. So,
yes.
But it just seems, I didn't know that was like the popular idea, and that just seems kind of ridiculous to me. So I'm glad that it was sort of empirically shown that there's something to it. Mm-hmm. Now your idea, which you say there's also some sort of reporting examples of, is that people have lucid dreamed in the same dream. Let's put it that way. Like there's a sort of shared space where they go to, they're dreaming, but they're interacting with each other, and then and they both are having that experience separately. And that for you, what you're saying is that would show essentially some kind of dualism, right? The mind cannot just be stuff going on in the brain. There's got to be a sort of separate space that these two people must be sharing. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, definitely. But yeah, that's fair. I'm not So if we talk about some historical models, I think that can be interesting, because you do have this like dualistic idea of like almost like a kind of separate world in early Christianity. And I think that's really interesting. But if you contrast that with some like the Runa, there's an excellent book, and it's a huge subject that you know, my reading on it doesn't contain the subject at all. But yeah, I commend it forward to anyone who's interested in a good read. It's How Forests Think by Eduardo Kohn. He lived amongst the Runa people close to Peru. And
can you say a bit more about the Runa people? Like, who are these people? I never heard of them. What time period are we talking? Like,
well, they're contemporary to us. They've lived in the rainforest of Peru. They're indigenous to that setting, to Peru. And yeah, it's one of these examples of a unbroken, because how deep they lived in the forest, they weren't, I don't want to say contaminated, but they weren't touched by colonization, mm-hmm. or any kind of like Western contact. They don't really interact with what we would call modern systems of living. They have a really interesting conception of the dream world, where it's not necessarily dual, but it's almost like there's a Shakespearean scholar named Edward Abbott who wrote about like dimensionalism was really big. So he wrote a lot about the fourth dimension, and this term he used was hyperthickness. And if you watch Carl Sagan's Cosmos, I think the 4th episode has a really awesome, Flatland. It was that whole thing. A lot of people have heard that, the Flatlander. So if you're on this kind of plane and a third dimensional thing comes, you only see the bottom of it, right? And so that's kind of their conception of the dream world. Almost gives you this kind of vision of things that are actually there. They're kind of permeating the setting. And so you also have that perspective as well that I kind of want to bring in. I don't have any truth claims about either, but I am interested. Kind of my project with dreams is to kind of see if that's even worthwhile to parse out. Which is it this kind of separate world that we can kind of access somehow in dreams? Is there kind of a like some kind of inhibitory function of waking consciousness that just makes us blind to things that are there all the time, which the kind of Runa model suggests in some ways. So I just wanted to kind of, when I hear dualism, I always want to put that perspective out there, because the Runa model. Does that make sense?
Yeah. All right. So dualism is, there's a separate kind of thing called the mind, and it's sort of kind of parallel to physical reality, and those are the only kinds of things. And what you're pointing out, what you're describing, is something kind of different, which is that there's a sort of separate, or there are other kind of aspects to reality that we don't have access to, and that dreams might be, the kind of shadow that we see of it, or to go with the metaphor that you used, right? If you're two-dimensional beings, if they were to interact with a three-dimensional thing, would only see a cross-section, and so dreams are that kind of cross-section for this thing that we're seeing. You mentioned this book, How Forests Think. So I'm not familiar with it, but the title is very interesting.
Yes.
What about? So how does this idea of forests thinking connect to this interpretation of the ontology of dreams that you're describing?
Well, primarily So the Runa conception is that the relations between selves kind of create this network of, life that is the forest. And they, like, what's really interesting about them is their words conform to sounds in the forest. So like, get out of the way, like I'm not fluent in the language, but kind of watch out, the equivalent to that, which is important in the forest. It sounds incredibly similar. It's like a thwack is kind of how they would say it. And it's like the sound of a tree falling. It's like almost uncanny. He has some recordings of it, Eduardo Kohn, in the talks he does. And so he essentially has this kind of, it's very shamanic, like classically shamanic in the way, and that can be kind of a problematic term because like shamans don't call themselves shamans. That's kind of a category that's been created. But they have this kind of three world conception, like earth, sky, and water, I think. Yeah. But so dreams create this kind of space where selves within this three world model can kind of communicate. And they're kind of their representations. It's like, so the forest tells the hunter which pig to kill. Like they've operationalized lucid dreaming to practice hunting, which I'll just mention now is really interesting because some of the most exciting studies on dreams are that if you take a golfer that someone playing golf and he plays golf and you hook an fMRI up to a brain scanning technology to the golfer, and then golfers that lucid dream, their brain the scans are exactly similar as they're lucid dreaming and as they're actually playing golf. And the golfers that do the lucid dreaming get better faster. They shoot lower faster. So that's really fascinating that the Runa have kind of operationalized lucid dreaming as a way to get better at hunting, which it seems like you would, from the data we have, throw spears better if you learned how to lucid dream. And they've kind of built a metaphysics around, like, ethically, like the forest kind of saying, okay, this pig's going to die. It's like a wild pig. And yeah, so that's, I think, really, really fascinating that they kind of developed that.
So the idea that the forest, which I'm kind of, the way you're describing it to me sounds kind of like maybe just the whole ecosystem of the forest has some kind of, has in it the knowledge of, what's the pig you're supposed to go after, or how are things supposed to be done, and the Runa people lucid dream in order to practice hunting and practices that they have to do, and interpret that as the forest kind of giving them the information while they're lucid dreaming.
Yes, exactly. I think that's fair. And what's interesting about that is something that, I mean, some of your listeners might be familiar with, like from that part of the world, is you've got this kind of ayahuasca kick going on in the West. Everyone's talking about it. It's very popular. Well, if you look at kind of the pharmacology of ayahuasca, it has a dialmethyltryptamine, which is DMT, like this thing that's actually highly related to dreaming. A lot of the plants in the rainforest have these compounds. Now, our stomach has a inhibitory enzyme that breaks down the DMT. Well, there's a particular bark from a tree, and these actually the vine and the bark don't actually grow in similar locations, which is interesting. And what not exactly the Runa, but similar indigenous cultures have said was like, yeah, we were dreaming, or we were kind of doing our kind of shamanic journeying, and they told us this, that this would happen, and that's how they describe this process of discovering this pretty obscure recipe. Like if you look at the density of life in the Amazon, the odds probably wouldn't be high. It is interesting to look at. The discovery of that recipe I'm pretty intrigued by it. But yeah, so they kind of have developed some kind of system that seems to have utility. And the nature of that utility is a mystery to me, I must admit, but I'm very interested in it.
So there had to be a combination of these two totally different plants in order to be able to create ayahuasca. And there's no real reason to think, to see why they would have. And they say the reason they did it is because they received that information in dreams.
Yeah, dreams, and also kind of like inhibitory states, like altered states of consciousness. But dreams are a huge component of most of these journeys. That's kind of the popularized term for them. Like you kind of close your eyes and go on a journey. The Runa are particularly interesting because especially when we get to Jung, and maybe even if we go through some more of the history, the Gnostics, they have this idea about taking ideas, big ideas, fantasies essentially, and kind of mytho-poeticizing them into a structure, into a form, into a song, a hero's song that can kind of, pull something out from a traumatic experience and make it worthwhile. And it seems like the Runa they do something that's as structured as anything I've seen. Every morning, groups of the Runa will go down, if they had what they consider a significant dream, they go down to the river and they write a song about it to the river, and they kind of formalize that and keep it. And it's extremely important to them based on their dreaming of the night before. And something that really struck me from how forests think is they have this idea of that the tree is the dream of the acorn. So I think they kind of see it as almost like the spark, like the big bang of something significant. These kind of altered states of these experiences. Yeah, it's a really fascinating model. So yeah, I think that one in particular, the kind of the formalizing of the kind of interplay before, let's just say, the more rational side of the brain that you need to draw on to write a song, for example. Combining that with like whatever is going on, and we can talk about it. We can talk about the structure of it in the brain, the neurobiology of it. But the combining of those separate parts of the brain, I think, is a really interesting practice. And I think it can maybe be disinhibited in the West a little, based on preferences and just perhaps like specialization.
Yes. Are you talking about a kind of, to use the sort of traditional idea of like the two halves of the brain, like using like activities that integrate both? Is that the kind of sort of what you're referring to?
That seems to be. So just to kind of bring that up to date a little bit. So while you're dreaming, I'm going to use, we might have an international audience, but I'm going to use an American idiom here. Like you have the limbic system, which is actually lower, and it's very emotional. When you're dreaming, that is lit up like a Christmas tree. Like it's more activity than you'll ever have when waking, even in a fit of rage or like the best sex you ever had. Like it's really activated in an incredible way. And now what has far lower activity, it's not quite turned off, but it's pretty much turned off, is the prefrontal cortex, which is disinhibits the limbic systems. And if we want to talk about Freud real quick, I mean, he would call that the superego, right? It's this thing that's pushing down the sex drive and the violence drive. and while sleeping, that is actually turned off. It's not active. And that's why, if we talk about remembering dreams, it seems like they're just slipping away. As that literally wakes up, it's pushing pushing the dream down. It's no, we're not going to remember that. And I think there's kind of a dance that they're doing there in that particular case that I was talking about, going down and writing a song where you're kind of honoring, they would say honoring both sides, those two biological phenomenon, let's say. And yeah, I think that from a self-improvement standpoint and just from like setting aside the metaphysical implications and whether or not they're right about it, I think that that's an interesting practice to try out if you can.
That's all really interesting. Let me take a step back again and kind of go, what do you know about the history of interpretations of the ontology of dreams? There's something, I think, inherently mysterious about what are these things. You know, like there's a tendency to be kind of deflationary about it nowadays. Yeah, you know, it's just this thing that the brain is doing. But, you know, in terms of the immediate experience of it, you know, you have the dream, then you remember it, and you know, to just think, what the hell is that?
Yeah, like how about this? Can I just run from, like, let's say, obviously this is a high level view, but like I think from ancient, let's stay in the West, like we've talked about Runa. So maybe we could go from the Pre-socratics to, like, say, Nietzsche with a really macro look. And then from there, I think we could maybe drill down a little more specifically and talk at length, because that's when I think it gets really interesting in a modern context. But yeah, I've read quite a bit on that long period. So yeah, I'll just chat a little bit about that and stop me if you want me to elaborate on anything. So
yeah, please.
Yeah, I would say, like, we should start at Parmenides, and I might butcher some of these names because they're a little obscure. But Parmenides is a pre-Socratic, probably, I think, 600 BC. And we're talking now the monad, right? We're talking everything kind of emanates from, like, either water or air, an element, or like what's it called? They had this kind of the aperon was another popular conception of it. And the reason I want to bring him up is because I think this is still an interesting argument to interrogate. He says, okay, how is it? If you're able to dream about something, it must exist in the first place. That's kind of something he says that's written. And I think that's really interesting argument. And I think it kind of, on the surface, is persuasive. But what does that mean about the kind of ontology of fantasy and all this other kind of, and the gods and metaphor? And that's what they were kind of investigating. And they kind of, you know, have this conception that things are flowing from, that we kind of have this element that's very malleable and we can kind of shape things. And from that, we launch into the Socratics, let's say, you know, Plato's writing of Socrates and Aristotle. And I think we'll have to start with Plato, because I think one thing he's, you know, we're talking about the forms, right? We're talking about that that dreams are a way to, I would just go to Philosophy 101 and talk about the cave and say, like, okay, through dreams, we can kind of get a flicker of the outside world and we can kind of see some of these forms. He has some really, and the Republic, I believe, is like what I was talking about, the mythopoetic bit. Like it's like a representation of the forms on Earth, and he does that in a few of his works. I'm not like a Plato scholar, but as far as I know, he does kind of belong in that tradition of people taking these kind of subjective ideals and trying to not objectify, but make them solid in a way through art and writing, etc. So I think that's really interesting.
When you were when you were describing the theory of dreams as being a kind of remnant of a higher of another higher aspect of reality that we have no access to, it immediately reminded me of Plato and the forms and his interpretation of, well, for him actually more like it's, you know, like everyday reality is sort of like shadows and remnants of the higher realm of the forms. So there's an interesting connection there.
Yeah, I think definitely. And I think, and so jumping into Aristotle, I think this is interesting because I think this is kind of where I like to go when chatting with people who have different views on like, I think with Aristotle, like, so and I'm not an expert on this, but it's going to become important as we move into Christianity. This kind of pivot towards the rational that's happening in Western civilization, the kind of embodiment of Christ as man, like, I think comes a lot from a reading of Christianity through Aristotle, and like, I believe a Kohn. Okay, we'll get there, but yeah. So I think you have to, and he talks about this. Aristotle talks about this, and I can't remember where, but dreams as a way to interrogate, like, arguments almost. And you do kind of have to make this jump into a truth, into another, a place where truth, the kind of place where two arguments kind of synthesize and the truth comes from that, in the dialectic, Aristotle's dialectics. I think the realm is still there in Aristotle, but maybe the praxis isn't there. The kind of dream, like the kind of stuff I'm talking about. Like, I think, yeah. So I do think the idea of of some ideas from Plato are left there, but I think this is the point where I wanted to mention this, that things start to where dreams become more delusion and more irrational, like the Stoics and the Epicureans don't have much time for dreams. And when we get to Christianity, this is something that becomes really interesting, because the people who engage with dreams are heretics, or in a monastery. The monastic tradition keeps dreams because they don't do the Eucharist. Because they don't go to church, right? They don't have the Eucharist, like in Syria, for example, in the Greek Orthodox Church or the Eastern Orthodox churches. They keep the dream. The dream stays alive, if you will, as a way to experience the divine, and that's what the dream is for the church. It's a way in which we can transcend matter and experience the divine, kind of in a more complete, in its more truthful representation, I guess you'd say, because
this is specifically in the Eastern Orthodox tradition.
Yeah, I mean, well, there's sects throughout the Eastern Med, but it's really codified there. And we actually, I mean, I'm gonna next move into the Gnostics, who it's kind of like shaman, like they didn't call themselves Gnostics, but they're heretics, right? They're people who, they're not interested in, like, theurgy. They're not interested in like a God emanating divine light into the wine and drinking it. They're like, they have this really interesting idea that there's this kind of malevolent, it's very William Blake. If you've read any of his poetry, he considered himself a Gnostic. It's like, this person who's purporting to be God is a dick, and we need to go back home to the stars where we belong. It's really kind of awesome, in my opinion. But they look at dreams as a way to kind of circumnavigate or circumvent these kind of restrictions of matter. And yeah, so that's kind of cool. And Jung, when we get to Jung, like, is really enchanted by these texts. So we didn't know a lot about them until the 60s, when we get the Nag Hammadi library is uncovered, and a lot of non-canonical Hellenistic Christianity from the first and second century found its way into the culture, and we're just kind of assimilating that. But, like, to kind of So essentially the idea is, okay, through dreaming, we can, it's very dualistic. We can transcend matter, would be my one sentence description of that. So then, one more person from Christianity, it would be Francis of Assisi. I think that's how you say it, Assisi. They have this idea of Magonia. Have you ever heard of that? Magonia is a really interesting mythical like realm where there's like these aerial sailors, and it has to do with weather. So like that was a huge that was a disagreement between like humans that they're trying to convert. Is like, no, like we're not going to give up our pagan kind of rituals for weather. Like we're not going to stop doing that, because if it stops raining, like we're screwed, and like we like this Christ figure and stuff, but we'll go to church, but we're still going to do our kind of cross-quarter rituals, and we're going to do our equinox stuff. And so Assisi had these visionary dream experiences that had to do with weather and this weather realm, Magonia. And it was like this, and the reason he's a saint is because, I shouldn't say that. I don't want to be too heretical, but I would say a political reason that had to do with him being a saint was that he brought a lot of pagans around to but like Christianizing weather magic, essentially, or accepting that Christ and the church could help them out with their weather. So yeah, I wanted to mention him.
So how does that actually get implemented into Christianity?
Well, because you can kind of pray to God. Like he demonstrated, it was said to be a miracle. So the idea is that with Christianity, I would say, is that polytheism is kind of redundant. And like you can just pray to Christ and God for weather and everything else. And they were saying, they were kind of hesitant about that. And Assisi had some miracles to do with, predicting the end of droughts and etc. And they're like, okay, this guy's a boss, so there's more to it than we thought there was. And it's in Italy, Assisi. I believe he's Italian. Mm-hmm. And yeah, that was like not a huge expert on his life, but when kind of that story always stuck with me because it was explicitly dreams. And we don't see a ton of that. And we're now going to pivot out of Christianity into the good guy. Well, the witches, essentially. We turn to witches, and witches are first. At first, we move into the Dark Ages. And one thing we got to understand about like the plague and all in Europe, the time we've just morphed into, is like Satan becomes the ultimate villain. He was kind of more, from a folk standpoint, this kind of like trickster figure for a lot of early Christianity, but the ultimate villain of God and this like evil, malevolent really starts happening around the time of the plague. And there's all these wars and stuff going on. It's a really shitty time for the church, the Roman Catholic Church. And Satan gets like, in the years before the Inquisition, like becomes a lot more badass. And so we start seeing the dreams of women in particular being what I would call like lucid dreams and like precognitive dreams. They're delusions and work of the devil. And there's this one really great story about King James IV, who became King James I, and they're torturing this poor witch. And the king goes to talk to her, and she recounts a story, allegedly, like the exact words of a conversation he had with, I think it was Catherine. I might be wrong on that one. Can't remember her name. She's from Denmark. And that they were like, whoa, that's Satan. So yeah, what I wanted to say is that we kind of have this pivot from the experiential knowledge of the divine to the work of like demons and the devil. And then
still interesting that even though we've shifted from experiencing the divine to the work of the devil, still an interpretation in which dreams are extremely important and extremely powerful.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yes, we're still there. And then we kind of get to, I would say, the Renaissance. And that's really interesting because you've got my favorite heretic is Bruno, who has this idea of the memory palace. So you lucid dream, and he's a polyglot, like extraordinaire, right? Like extremely talented individual. But the way he would do that is what he wrote about is he has this memory palace. So he would study things all day, and then he would kind of lucid dream this kind of library where he would store things, and then he could close his eyes and go there consciously and pull it out. And the writer of Sherlock Holmes, I'm blanking, what's his name? I can't remember the author of Sherlock Holmes right now, but he actually gives Sherlock Holmes this ability fictionally. He talks about it.
I've read about this technique from Derren Brown. Do you by any chance know who he is?
The mentalist.
Yeah. I'm a huge fan of his. He actually was really influential for me, and it's kind of, it's a whole kind of backstory to it. But when I was actually first getting into Jung, I was also really getting into Derren Brown, and they became strangely associated in my mind.
I'm glad you said that. Not to go on a tangent, but I think we have been talking about some pretty, some subjects that are, let's say, somewhat far afield from, normal scientific investigation. And I think Derren Brown is an excellent, I call it running, like you need to know, if you're interested in the subject, you need to know all of the ways cognitive biases get in your way. And there's no better source than Derren Brown. Like his book will teach, like you definitely can separate the wheat from the chaff of mystical experiences or what have you by understanding all the ways that you create them for yourselves. And yeah, I think he's a really actually important figure for this kind of work.
So I read his book, Tricks of the Mind.
Yeah, exactly.
And he's interesting to talk about in regard to all this because he's, of course, he's a major skeptic, right? He's sort of skeptical of, anything that has a kind of supernatural type of interpretation. He's, a blanket skeptic of all of that. And part of his sort of part of his appeal is that he kind of recreates the kinds of things that you would expect that seem to be supernatural. And he says, well, it's all just tricks of the mind. So I've always found them to be a kind of very interesting counterpoint to the kind of psychic phenomena that seems to point to the supernatural. Anyway, that's just as an aside. You can continue with the history of it. This stuff is fascinating.
Okay, great. So we're in the Renaissance. So we've got Bruno. And what I want to talk about here is this is I think an important turning point because I think we somewhat see a reaction, or we see the genesis of a reaction to the Enlightenment here, and we see it in. So we have Bruno, who is an occultist, and is eventually.
And I'm sorry. Let me just be clear about this. So, what is the memory palace sort of memory technique, which is really what that is? How does it connect to dreams?
Well, so he would store it. Well, this is my interpretation. I don't know how good the translation is, but my interpretation of the memory palace is he would stock it while lucid dreaming.
Okay, so okay, I see. He would fill the memory palace with things to remember while actually lucid dreaming.
Yeah, he never uses that terminology, but while dreaming, and he uses some kind of some words that I would interpret as lucid dreaming. So yeah, I do. Let's preface it with that. But yeah, so my interpretation of the memory palace is a kind of psychic structure, let's say, within his unconscious somewhere that he, with a lot of practice, kind of stored with the incredible amount of information he was consuming, and was able to kind of pull it out as like a show almost. It seems like, yeah. and we're talking a lot of stuff. He was a brilliant mathematician, astrologer, occultist, everything, kind of in that archetypally Renaissance sense. But then jumping into, so the reason I want to talk about these guys, we're going to talk about Ficino and Da Vinci. And I think what we see here, the pivot from the kind of experience of the divine, is we see the dreams as this kind of wellspring of creativity. And we definitely see that with Ficino, but most interestingly with Da Vinci, which a lot of people don't know this, but he did that weird, they have a funny name for it now, but that kind of episodic sleeping patterns where you nap throughout the day.
Polyphasic sleep?
Yeah. He was a huge proponent of that, and would just, and would, a lot of especially with drawing, a lot of his drawings, he just kind of, from his journals, he would just kind of stumble out and just start drawing and try to, keep that creative force conscious as long as possible. So I think that's a really interesting pivot. And I wanted to mention the kind of reaction to the Enlightenment, because we go into, from the Renaissance into, like, let's say, these conceptions, specifically in England, of like the sublime. And I think this is actually related to the rise of Napoleon in some ways, because you're kind of stuck in like England, and England's pretty bleak, but they, Coleridge and Wordsworth, they'll eventually start, their predecessors are talking about kind of the sublime, right? And they're kind of pulling these beautiful imagery out of kind of the bleak English landscape. And obviously, Kubla Khan is from a dream, Coleridge. And so we get Wordsworth and Coleridge, working with dreams as a kind of wellspring of creativity, and kind of engaging with the landscape in dreams, which circling back to the Runa, I think is really interesting idea. And the question I would pose about reality is that if I dream about an experience on a hill, and it's transcendent in some ways, it's activating serotonin, and I'm having an emotional response from it, and I can then go to that place while awake. And we know from the research that's been done that that, and I write kind of a visionary poem there, and I have a similar kind of cognitive experience. Like, I think that's an interesting phenomenon to kind of interrogate, because if there's like an angel in the dream that is creating this experience for me, and I go back, what then is creating that experience? If it's duplicated, which is kind of what Coleridge and Wordsworth and some of these poets are kind of saying is happening. I think that's kind of an interesting test case. And it's something I'm really interested in.
So what would they say is causing it when you go during your waking time?
I don't know. I mean, there's no angel, like, or that thing that you dreamed about that kind of triggered that, isn't there, obviously. Like, or at least you don't see it, but you're having this kind of sync with the dream. And the Runa just say it's there, you can't see it. We aren't as comfortable with that. It's not very empirical. So, but I do think, it's undeniable that it's happening. I think that's really interesting. I don't know where to place that phenomenology. As a phenomenon. I think I'm really, this is where I think things start heating up that become interesting from like a practical standpoint is right here. And I think, I think this kind of leads us into the birth of psychoanalysis, really, and Nietzsche. Well, you have to start with Nietzsche because, and I actually haven't been able to find a lot about Nietzsche in dreams. Thus Spoke Zarathustra is written in this kind of, it seems to be written in like some kind of mad, altered state of consciousness, but it's not explicitly a dream. But I think why he's important.
There are dreams in it, though.
Right. Yeah.
I think, and I think. Well, and thus spoke Zarathustra. And for anybody who doesn't know, this is one of Nietzsche's major works. But it's also interesting in being a major philosophical work that's a work of fiction. It's just a metaphorical kind of rant.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think probably the most climactic moment is when the demon. There's the sort of demon that tells Zarathustra the parable of the eternal return, right? The idea of this life is repeating endlessly and will repeat again and again in exactly the same way without any difference. If I remember correctly, the first time that happens, it happens in a dream. He's visited by the demon in a dream. Maybe he's not told the whole parable in the dream, but he's first introduced to it in a dream. I don't know if you remember better than I do. It's been a while.
Yeah, you're right about that. And actually, my experience with Thus Spoke Zarathustra is so colored by the Jung has an 1,100 word seminar. It was spoken, but it wasn't recorded, so I've just read the transcript. It's 1,100 words, and on the first 150 pages, or in the first third, I think. I forget how long it is. So it's like, and there's so much detail in that it's just kind of orthogonal to the text almost, that I don't want to speak too specifically about it. But yeah, there's definitely within Nietzsche's work, there's a lot of allusions to dreams for sure. I don't know what his dream life was like or his creative process so much. But yeah, definitely. But the reason I wanted to specifically mention him, though, is because he, in the Genealogy of Morals, takes this position of analyzing the reason someone would believe a philosophical argument, like the underlying reason. And I think this is really, and both Freud and Jung, actually Freud's biographer quotes Freud as saying that the most self-aware person that ever lived was Nietzsche. And that's a huge compliment coming from Freud. And Jung, this is a seminal figure for Jung because of, I would say his project is dealing with the implications of the death of God. The thing that people don't usually, the statement continues, and like it almost as a prediction of World War I and World War II, that we'll never clean up all the blood. We killed him and we'll never be able to scrub the blood. It's like really a severe passage. And I'm paraphrasing there. Anyway, but Nietzsche has this idea of looking at the kind of unconscious factors on why someone would believe a philosophical argument. And this was kind of, I think, I would say this is kind of seminal in the development of like the idea, the permission to do that is really important to Freud. And of course, Freud writes his first book on dream analysis. It's published within weeks of Nietzsche's death in 1899. And that seems to be like an important turning point. A lot of people, like historians, like to mark this point as significant. And I think it is. So I think I definitely want to touch on him before moving on to Freud, which is probably, dream interpretation proper. Like that's the best, a great way to start.
And that concludes today's episode of Who Shapes the Barber? Next week, Brian Nuckols will explain both Freud and Jung's interpretations of dreams and the psyche before going over techniques for dream analysis and lucid dreaming. Again, I'm William Nava. You can check out other episodes, as well as my other philosophical and artistic work at williamnava.com. And if you'd like to subscribe to this podcast, go to williamnava.podbean.com. Thank you so much for listening.